Chapter 23, Section 3, The End of the Cold War. Did Reagan's foreign policies contribute to the fall of communism in Europe? So by the end of the chapter, analyze ways that Reagan challenged communism in the Soviet Union, explain why communism collapsed in Europe and in the Soviet Union, and then also describe other foreign policy challenges that faced the United States during the 1980s. So one of the ways that he's going to challenge communism is by building up the military, this concept of peace through strength. And what we're going to see is the biggest peacetime military buildup in the history of the United States. And the idea here is by increasing defense spending in the military budget, and by launching this idea of a strategic defense initiative known as Star Wars, where you'd have this ground, air, satellite defense system that would use lasers to shoot missiles out of the sky. Even though that never came to be, by throwing that out there and by working on it, what it's going to do is it's going to force the Soviet Union to spend boatloads of money trying to keep up with the United States, to keep up with the military spending, and then to try and come up with something that is similar to the Strategic Defense Initiative. And eventually what Reagan's goal is that it's going to bankrupt the Soviet Union, that they're just simply not going to be able to spend enough money to be able to keep up, and that's what's going to kind of weaken the Soviet Union. The other thing is, all throughout the world, he is going to aid anti-communist groups. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the United States is going to help fund and supply and train the Mujahideen. These are these freedom fighters that are trying to drive the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. One of the interesting members of the Mujahideen is Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was a wealthy prince from the Arab region, and he was passionate about freeing Muslim peoples from foreign control. And so he goes and he joins the freedom fighters in Afghanistan. And later on, he's going to turn around and take some of this funding and training and weaponry and use it against what he sees as the capitalistic overreaches of the United States into the Middle East. And so that's why he's going to target the World Trade Center in the 1980s. And then again in 2001, he's going to more successfully bomb and destroy the World Trade Center. In Latin America, we're going to back the Contras. They're fighting against the Sandinistas, which was a communist government. The Sandinistas came to power during the Carter administration, when President Carter withdrew the support from the Contras and the Nicaraguan government. Well, now President Reagan's going to reverse course. He's going to send money in there, and he's going to try and help the Contras defeat the Sandinistas. And also in El Salvador, we're trying to get rid of what we see as a socialist government. We're spending up to $1 million a day in El Salvador. That's going to help fund these death squads that are going to kill somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people, many of them innocent people. In Grenada, which we see as a communist type country, we introduce sanctions on them, and in retaliation, they capture a university that has American students in that university. So we send the Marines in to free them and bring them back home. The other thing that makes a big difference here in the Soviet Union is a change in leadership. Brezhnev dies, he's replaced by Gorbachev. And Gorbachev is going to change the Soviet Union in some pretty stark and significant ways. He's going to have two programs, Glasnost, a new openness, and what he's going to do there is he's going to allow for more Western ways and Western ideas and Western peoples into the Soviet Union. So he wants to rebuild and normalize relations with the West. Perestroika is a move towards capitalism. And the reason behind all of these things is the Soviet economy is not good. It's not doing well. There's food shortages. Their factories aren't keeping up with Western factories. Gorbachev pretty much realizes that the Soviet system is ultimately a failure, and he needs the Soviet Union to become more like the West. Because of this softening, Reagan is able to go back on a promise where he said he would never meet with a communist leader. He sees Gorbachev as someone that he can work with, and that he can negotiate with and he can do business with. So the two leaders are going to meet, and it's going to form a pretty decent friendship between these two individuals. Now, despite that, he is getting hit pretty hard from the far right, that he is getting soft on communism. So in 1987, he gives this famous speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And what's going to happen over the course of the next 2 years is that the communist system is going to start disintegrating all over Eastern Europe. And so when in 1989, East Germany and West Germany announced reunification, then the Berlin Wall, the Brandenburg Gate, is opened, and that's going to lead to the fall of the wall. And this famous picture in the lower right-hand corner there of people taking sledgehammers and axes to the wall and tearing it down and destroying it. And then what you see is communist governments all over Eastern Europe are just going to topple like dominoes, and the communists are going to get thrown out of power. The Soviet Union, the same thing's going to happen, is these United Soviet Socialist Republics, one by one, little by little, they're going to break off and form their own countries. Now, they're not going to go quietly, at least the Soviets aren't going to go quietly. In 1991, there's a coup attempt where they're going to try and overthrow Gorbachev. However, Boris Yeltsin, who is the leader of Russia, backs Gorbachev. And, this is going to lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union. And Reagan plays a pretty critical role in that. One, by putting the financial screws to them, by increasing military spending. The other thing is by reaching out to Gorbachev and then challenging Gorbachev. All of those things are going to contribute to the end of the Cold War. And so after 47 years, this one thing that has dominated our foreign policy and has dominated our focus and our time and our energy and our efforts and our money and our military is over. That doesn't mean that there aren't troubles other places. The Middle East is really kind of going to become the hotbed of all the new trouble. We had sent Marines into Lebanon to help in a civil war that Lebanon was going through. We're trying to help protect innocent civilians. We're trying to do all kinds of things there. And on October 3rd, 1983, a suicide bomber drives a van full of explosives into a Marine barracks, killing 247 or nearly 300 Marines. And at that point, we pull our Marines out of Lebanon. The other person that we're having a lot of trouble with is Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He is funding terrorist organizations all around the world, but in particular in the Middle East. And one of those terrorist organizations bombs a nightclub in Berlin that a lot of American servicemen go to. It's right next to an American base. And that nightclub bombing, again, kills several American servicemen. And in retaliation, there's a U.S. air raid on Libya. We bombed several of Gaddafi's homes. And one of those homes, his daughter was, and we killed his daughter. And at that point, Muammar Gaddafi kind of quiets down a little bit, and he doesn't quite cause as much trouble. It's not going to be until the Obama administration that Gaddafi is causing issues and problems again, and then we're going to finally take Gaddafi out, target his home, and we kill him, and then Libya's kind of been a mess ever since a little bit. The real big issue in the 1980s, and I remember this as I was in high school, is this Iran-Contra affair. So the U.S. doesn't like to pay money to get hostages back. And there are a number of U.S. hostages that are held in Lebanon by a group known as Hezbollah. So in order to try and get those hostages back and not actually directly pay for those hostages to be returned, this Iran-Contra thing gets kind of cooked up. So in 1982, U.S. weapons are sold or given to Israel. Israel turns around and sells those to Iran. The U.S. can't directly sell to Iran because we have an arms embargo on Iran for capturing the hostages in 1979. So we have all kinds of sanctions and embargoes in Iran. But by going through Israel, Israel can deal with Iran. And then Iran had promised to pressure Lebanon to release those hostages. And in exchange, Iran then pays Israel money for those weapons, and then Israel pays that money to the Contras so that the Contras can continue to fight against communism. The reason we can't give the money directly to the Contras in 1983, Congress banned funds to the Contras because of some of the not so nice things that they were doing in Nicaragua. So this is a way to fund this anti-communist group and go around Congress's back. In 1986, this whole thing blows up. It's hard to know whether Reagan really ordered it or not, but at some point he does become aware of some of these shiftings of monies and weapons and kind of where they're loosely going to. But what ends up happening is several of his top officials take the fall for all of this and are convicted. And as this newspaper article in the New York Times shows, when President Bush comes into office, he pardons the 6 that were convicted. Now, where this really gets to be messy is that Iran, with these new U.S. weapons, is beginning to defeat Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. So they had been at war since the early 1980s over a border dispute, and we don't want Iran to win because Iran is one of our political enemies. So in exchange, what we do is we send arms, technology, and information to Saddam Hussein in Iraq so that they can now use these American arms and technology to help defeat Iran. And as we know, later on, we go to war against Iraq in the first Gulf War, but then also again in 2001 or 2002 when we go to war against Saddam a second time.